Hi, I'm Ted Haptegaber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see. We welcome Bill Bratton and Connie Rice to Live Talks Los Angeles. They'll discuss Bill Bratton's book, The Profession, a memoir of community, race, and the arc of policing in America. Bill Bratton served as chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, chief of the New York City Transit Police, and commissioner of the Boston Police Department and the New York City Police Departments. Connie Rice is one of the top civil rights lawyers in the country and author of Power Concedes Nothing. She is known for fighting systemic injustice and for both suing police and working with them to get safety in inner city America. They will talk, and towards the end, I will pose some questions sent in from you in the audience. I will let you take it from here, Connie.
Thanks, Chad. Listen, it's a great pleasure to be with Chief. Great to see you.
Nice to be seen.
Listen, congratulations on the book. It's out of the blocks with a great start. When I was reading through it, it really made me realize you've had such an epic journey, not just through policing, but through a lot of the racial issues in the country. And so, do you think you could have found better timing to release this book, I have to say?
Actually, its publisher was beating my co-author, Peter Noble, and I up very badly because we were about a year and a half behind in delivering the book. And now they're very happy because it came out at this particular point in time, which is almost an inflection point. So sometimes delay works out to the benefit, to be a benefit.
Yeah, an inflection point, because I think we're in the fifth national reckoning over race in this country. And I think the book hits at a time when we're having almost a war over policing and its direction, which way for policing. And so it's a real crisis, and you couldn't have come out at a better time. I just wanted to say to for the audience that you and I are unlikely allies. I should have been suing you, but when you got to Los Angeles after the Rampart police scandal of LAPD, and you took over as an outside chief, which is in its own way, it has its own physics. LAPD was in crisis, the city was in crisis, and you stated your vision as follows. You said, I'm not leaving here until African Americans in this city feel that this department has improved. And you said a second thing, my vision is as follows. We, the police, have been the cause of most of the racial uprisings in this country. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could be the catalyst for the healing? Mm-hmm. Why? You're one of the few white chiefs who talk about race in that way. Talk about that vision.
Well, it's something I've deeply believed in for most of my career, because for most of my career, race and policing, both good and bad policing, have been entwined, that you can't separate the two. In America, the two of them have been connected since the founding of this country. And that to be successful in policing, ultimately you got to be successful in dealing with the issue of race. I was first exposed to it as a young cop in Boston at the height of the school busing and school desegregation, housing desegregation issues in Boston. Boston was probably one of the most racially divided, most racially segregated cities in the North. And I grew up in that city. But during the 70s, the turmoil, the violence around the issue of desegregation equaled just about anything you might have found in the South. And so it was driven home to me very early on in my police career that in a profession that was not a profession at that time, it certainly is now, but it was developing into a profession, that to achieve success as a profession, we were going to have to address consistently the issue of race. We weren't going to succeed. And I desired to be a leader of policing from my earliest days as a young cop, a young sergeant, a young lieutenant. That's what I aspired to be. I wanted to be a dominant voice in American policing. And I understood that if I were to be successful, if my profession were to be successful, we could not run away from this issue. We had to face it head on. And so throughout my career, I've been comfortable dealing with a very uncomfortable issue, and that is race in America and race and policing in America.
The thing that's striking about the book is how you said that in every single department that you were in, you confronted the corruption and the racism. But you were one of the few white cops who could see it. And why don't you talk about what you saw and why you think you could see it clearly, but that most of your white colleagues couldn't?
You know, Connie, I wish I had an answer to that, but let me attempt it. I was very fortunate that in the 70s, as I was coming into policing, there was a time of great change in policing that we came out of the turmoil of the 50s and 60s, and Kerner Report and other national commissions said the police had to change. And one of the things they needed to change was they needed to be much more professional, and that they needed to be much better educated. They needed to be much more researched. They needed to be much better leadership. And so I was able to take advantage to the many new programs that were being offered, including my college education was paid for by federal grants that encourage police officers to get college degrees. And in the case of Boston, I worked full-time as a Boston police officer, but then also went full-time to college. And so I acquired an education at a very critical time in my development as a police officer. I did not get wrapped in the blue cocoon of policing like so many of my contemporaries. I was also experiencing the broader world of a very liberal college education. And I was exposed to a lot of very different points of view about policing, as you might imagine, going to college in the 70s. And two of my favorite courses at that time were urban geography and art appreciation. That's ART with my Boston accent, art appreciation. And those two instructors, Betsy Usey in urban geography, and I write about this in the book because it was such a significant part of my beginnings, if you will, to see people, to see the issue of race, to see the importance of policing and resolving the issue of race. And Dr. Avenatti used to take us out to museums. There were many of them near where I went to college, Museum of Fine Arts and many others, Gardner Museum. And what he taught us was that look at a picture. You might not like what you see, but you need to understand its significance. You need to, in some respects, see beyond the picture, see behind the picture. So I don't like Renaissance art, I still don't, but I understand its importance in the evolution of mankind. I don't like Picasso, for example, but I understand his significance at that period of time. But the most important lesson was to not judge things by what you initially see, but to try to really see it, to see behind it. And so I think so many of my contemporaries in that era of the 70s and 80s, coming out of the 50s and 60s, when they saw a black face, they saw maybe a different face than I might have been seeing. They were seeing the high rates of crime. They were seeing the ghetto, if you will. And I was fortunate from the beginning that I didn't have that bias, I guess you might call it, that prejudice, and it benefited me, I think, for the rest of my policing career.
Well, you know, that's really the way you put it in terms of you could see beyond, but you could also see the humanity. And Sweet Alice Harris, a prominent activist in Los Angeles, said, "Chief, you see us." She's an activist in Watts. And you could see the humanity. And I remember when you sent me to interview about 800 cops and roundtables, and so many of them called their policing search and destroy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is the policing they did in South Bureau, which is where it's mostly black and brown, poor people. And the policing that's done there is very different from the policing that's done on the wealthy West Side. And and when you have that kind of policing, search and destroy, they call it shock and awe, hunting, fishing,
Hook 'em and
and
book 'em. It was the
yeah,
phrase in Los Angeles.
hook 'em and book 'em.
Hook 'em and book 'em.
It does the opposite of what you just said, which is it dehumanizes everybody.
Mhm.
Talk about the policing in the inner city and the impact that that has on cops, a lot of white cops especially not being able to see the humanity of poor African Americans and Latinos.
Well, I think what happens is that for the longest time, many of police came from fairly stable communities, if you will. That most police departments were predominantly white. It wasn't until maybe the 70s and 80s we started to really recruit more actively from minority communities and minorities who were coming out of communities that were being policed by those white cops for most of those years. So coming out of relatively stable communities and then coming into the violence of the ghettos, the degradation of human life, the conditions there, you can understand how biases would perform, how they would see it differently from coming from where they came from. And I think what I was able to escape was forming those biases or prejudices, but rather, as Dr. Abinaitis told us, or Betsy Useem in urban geography, the importance and success of cities was the blending of all these many different people and cultures and races and ethnicities. And what ends up happening is that so many cops that they're exposed to this, and they change because they just really don't know how to deal with it, don't know how to see it, if you will. And I think one of the challenges for policing is, particularly going forward, is to do a much better job of training before they get into those communities to understand what they're getting into, why some of those communities are the way they are, that it's not anything that the people who are living there in some respects created. It's conditions that were forced upon them by many outside factors. A lot of them are factors involving bias, involving racial animosity, involving the history, so much of the history of our country as it relates to different people, Black people, brown people, people of different ethnic backgrounds. So it's an incredible challenge. I think we've been doing better, and I think we're influenced significantly by the fact that we are starting to look a lot more like the rest of America. LA, for example, is a majority police department now, largely minority Latino, reflective of the huge influx of Latinos. But still, I think about 15% African-American in a city now. It's only about 10% African-American. New York City's police population reflects almost exactly, percentage-wise, the makeup of the city. And that's a good thing, because cities are still going to be the future of our country. It's not going to be the suburbs. It's not going to be the rural areas. Cities are still what's going to drive our economies going forward. And the more we get along, the more we get to see each other, that's going to be the secret of actually being able to evolve in a very successful way.
You know, you're bringing up the construction of ghettos and the fact that you send police in there, and the theory that the Kerner Commission had and a number of other reports that analyzed the causes of the racial riots in the 60s said, look, it was an uprising against second-class citizens, white anti-Black racism, institutionalized racism, deprivation and poverty, all of the things that you just said. And until those things get fixed, what we've really done is we've constructed ghettos and barrios. White society, privileged society, has constructed those ghettos, and then we send the cops in there to do a thin blue line around them to contain and suppress the misery we know is in there. And when you do that, you're going to corrupt the police. You've corrupted that community. Talk about that context. We send cops in to be the thin blue line to make sure that what's in the ghetto and the barrio doesn't reach my neighborhood or Nancy Reagan's neighborhood.
Well, compounding the issue is that the barrios, as you call them out in the West Coast, the ghettos, as they call, although we tend to not use that term any longer. We now talk about poorer neighborhoods, disadvantaged neighborhoods, that they actually tend to need police more than other areas because unfortunately the conditions that exist there, higher crime rates, higher social disorder, higher rates of calls from people looking for the police to help deal with issues that are not addressed by the police in more affluent communities. I've also, I think, come to understand better my process of education evolution. Over the last several years, some of the studies that have been done, the recent attention paid to Tulsa, the massacre that occurred there 100 years ago, and showing how a highway that was built back in the 90s went right through the Black community and effectively destroyed what was the Black community there for the second time. And then if you look at what Robert Moses did here in New York City, when I ride around New York City, where are all those expressways built right through the poorest neighborhoods? And but for uprisings in the 60s and 70s, he would have built some of them right through the middle of Manhattan. And I look at my own city, Boston, in the sense of where some of the expressways were built up there, that there's a form of racism that the idea is we're not going to basically tear up white neighborhoods. We're going to just do it in the poorer neighborhoods. So that form of discrimination. No, this is that part of the education of understanding that so many of the conditions in the disadvantaged neighborhoods were not the doing of the people who lived there, but were the doing of others who sought to benefit for themselves and their institutions because they could do it there, because the voices weren't strong enough, the politics weren't strong enough to resist.
Exactly. You know, one of the things that really stuck with me was when we were talking about policing, and you and I would arm wrestle over the sources of inspiration for American policing, and you would talk about Sir Robert Peel, and I would talk about slavery. And we went to a slave artifacts store together, and we were looking. What did you think when you were in that store, and what did you take away from that joint venture of ours?
Yes, I'm a student of history, if you will, both policing history, but history in general, particularly an interest in the Civil War and World War I, World War II, and particularly with the contemporary writings of today, the appreciation of how issues of race permeated all of those wars. That I had some awareness, some fairly significant awareness of slavery and its horrible conditions, but as we know, with the movement of history, we've learned much more intimacy. So in that store that you took me to, and now that store has been magnified 100-fold by the museum in Washington, D.C., that has a phenomenal collection of slave artifacts. The idea of seeing in person a lot of what I would have seen on television shows, et cetera, whether acting on a drama or in some of the real life types of documentaries, to see it firsthand, that whether it's the plaque you gave me to hang in my office or the thing that you wanted me to really see was the badges indicating that policing in America back to its early origins, particularly in the South, but aided by other laws that required Northern police forces to also engage in slave hunting or slave returning, that the visual impression of seeing this in person, the shackles and the neck braces and all the horrific devices that were used, that you couldn't help but be sobered by what you saw, and I certainly was.
Yeah, the badges were amazing. They looked exactly like today's badges, only plantation of Green Acres was around the edge instead of City of Boston. And I remember your reaction. That arc of the profession. You said recently, I think it was last summer, that the problems with policing began in slavery when the first cops enforced order on the slave ships. And that really struck me because very few chiefs start there. And when so you have an understanding of the systemic nature of the racism in this country, especially the anti-Black racism. Today's crisis, I mean, we're in a real crisis with policing. You've got the African American community wondering whether the paramilitary suppression that they see, that I think officers, a lot of the officers I know mean to deliver safety because they're chasing bad guys, but really in executing wars on drugs and wars on gangs that can't be won, being given a whole lot of missions that police can't do, and because politicians have refused to solve those problems, it makes for a really toxic mission. And the conditions that you talk about in inner city America, that prompt despair and create the violence and the conditions that you see, all of that actually makes it almost impossible for us to resolve this crisis with policing without taking a hold of the third rail of those conditions. Do you see any way, because cops don't feel they can be safe in these communities, doing foot beats, responding in the way they do in the suburbs, what do you think has to change to get out of this crisis? Because it's a real crisis right now.
You raised a lot of issues in your comments just now, Connie, that the crisis this time is different because the tools we use to deal with the rises in crime back in the 70s and 80s and 90s is not going to be the tolerance there was for the tools that we use, the hook 'em and book 'em, crack down on crime, even the language that we would have used. That the challenge right now, the dilemma is that we don't have answers for what's going on in America right now. This resurgence, particularly of shootings and murders and domestic violence, a lot of it blamed on the coronavirus. Virus, I think, was an influence, but I think that's too simplistic an answer. That a lot of this was always just beneath the surface, and now there's been an opportunity for it to explode once again. And the medicines that we used in the past, many of them are not going to be allowed to be used this time for good reason. And the dilemma for the front page story in the New York Times today was about mayors wrestling with this new crime surge, just as America wants to get out in the streets once again after being locked up for a year. That how are they going to deal with it? And none of them, and I'll be quite frank, I don't think any of my former colleagues in policing have an answer to it right at the moment. It's going to require phenomenal dialogue to figure out how do we get out of this mess. One, how did we get into it? We have a lot more understanding about how we got into it. But now getting out of it's going to be so much more difficult. I wish I had some of the answers I had for it back in the 90s and then in the 21st century. But some of those answers aren't acceptable anymore. Some of them are, but it's a matter of, if you will, changing the dosage, if you will, changing the way they're applied. And it's really going to require a phenomenal amount of research, dialogue, trying to find common ground that just how much police action our community is going to be willing to accept, how much shared responsibility will communities, black and white and brown, be willing to accept. That police can't do it alone. And one of the reasons that police have become less effective in many respects in the current crises is that it's the built up effects of 50 years of failure dealing with homelessness, dealing with the emotionally disturbed, dealing with the narcotics issues, and now dealing with the crime issues around guns. That police have been the safety net of society, has failed in all of those ways. And the safety net that we provided is very frayed at the moment, as evidenced by the demonstrations of the past year or so after George Floyd's murder. And that safety net is not going to be able to bear the additional burdens of the 21st century, which include the cybercrime issues, the terrorism issues that police have always been overburdened, even just dealing with crime and disorder. But in the 21st century, we are phenomenally overburdened with the complexities that everybody is looking for police to resolve. We are not the solution to so much of what ails America. And I think that's beginning to dawn on people, that safety net that we provided, particularly in the last 20, 30 years, where we were able to reduce crime so dramatically, people breathe a sigh of relief. Well, everything seems fine. But we now have come to fully understand that everything isn't fine, that we have not resolved the dilemmas of all these societal issues. And the safety net the police provided to keep it from literally collapsing that safety net is so frayed now that it is in real danger of collapsing.
You know, one of the things that came out of the Black Lives Matter and post George Floyd murder physics, the dynamics that we've seen for the last 18 months, was that I think that what we were looking at, and after the insurrection, January, you take those two bookends, and I was listening to African American cops, and you had good relationships with the Black cops who stayed in LAPD, and they found you refreshing. But now, after the protests last summer, there was a huge revulsion inside of most of policing. And I was on some of the Zoom calls of some of the roll calls. They didn't know I was on the phone, but I would hear sergeants talking like, you know, these Black Lives Matter activists, we're going to treat them just like we did the Black Panthers. And the Black cops were recoiling because they saw this as a moment to actually talk about the racism they experience, even as Black cops, from their departments. And they were shut down. And the social media of the cops was exploding with all of these furious comments about Black Lives Matter. But after the January 6th insurrection, the social media was crickets, silence, not even a condemnation of the beating of cops with American flags. And the Black cops I talked to say, you know, we can't accept this. Can you explain that dynamic, that there's, even though the Black Lives Matter movement is infuriating to officers, and I get why, that they couldn't see what was behind those protests and the protests against those videos of shootings of unarmed African Americans, and exploded in fury at that, and mostly peaceful protests, but would be silent in reaction to a violent insurrection that almost killed cops?
I think some of that has to do with going back to the expression of seeing each other, or seeing beyond the initial image. From a cop perspective, that the idea of the demonstrations that some 20 million people engaged in, there was also, unfortunately, the violence that took place in so many cities, and the anarchist element that was taking advantage of these large-scale demonstrations to advance their cause, which is anarchy. And so the cops tended to, I think, blend all three together. The demonstrations, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, the vast majority of which were peaceful and which were, for the first time in history, really multiracial. The whites, by and large, outnumbered, because whites outnumber Blacks in this country, outnumbered the Blacks in those demonstrations. And that was something I think took so many police, so many of us by surprise. That where did this anger come from, in the sense of the white community in support of the Black Lives Matter issue? But it went beyond that. The whites themselves were angry at other things that were going on that they were concerned with. And so the cops, in the sense of dealing with these three forms of demonstrations, tended to focus on the ones that were most at risk to them. That basically was the looting, the burglaries, the actual fighting with the cops, the damage to their vehicles, and then the anarchists who were seeking to really stir it up. And so that tended to form a degree of bias, I think, in the sense of as they were injured in very large numbers with those rocks and bottles that were being thrown. And I think many of the larger demonstrations sought to try to control the tail end of the demonstrations, the rioting and the looting, because they understood it was working against their cause, but was also creating an antagonism on the part of the cops in dealing with the larger marches. So it's just, but your comment about the January 6th insurrection, that silence, if you will, from my profession, I'm very concerned about that also, because but for the actions of those Capitol police officers, our democracy could have collapsed on that day. We were at such a risk of that. And so not to have empathy and sympathy for those Capitol police being attacked by, in some instances, fellow law enforcement officers who were there demonstrating, I just don't get it. To me, it's still an unresolved or unsolved mystery. about that. And it's something we're going to have to deal with and face going forward, that this idea of this latent anger, this anger beneath the surface on the part of so many of our police. And this is where talking about resolution, solution, that we're going to have to spend a lot more time on training, going to have to spend a lot more time on understanding the history. And one of the things, John Timoney, I have a quote of his, my former first deputy in New York, a much beloved figure in policing in New York City, Miami, and Philadelphia. John had an expression that those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it, and those who know the police know they don't know their history. And we don't know the involvement of police going back to the slave catching days. We don't know the history of police in the sense of seeking to be used by government against the creation of the unions and labor demonstrations. That we tend to only know the history of our current time. And we don't understand how do we get to the current time if we don't know history. And it's something we don't teach. I don't know of a police department in America that teaches history in their recruit training, because they just don't have enough time, because there's so much we try to cram into those kids in 6 months. So going forward, some of the thinking I've been doing is, how did we get to where we are? And nobody is happy where we are. So how do we get out of here and go forward? And if you don't know your history, you're never going to go forward. And if you do, you have to repeat that bad history that nobody wants to repeat anyway.
You know, you talked about safety a little bit earlier in one of your responses, and one of the lessons that then Captain Beck and later Chief Beck, who succeeded you in LAPD, one of the lessons that we took from working with you to enforce the consent decree was that the policing in our poorest areas, our abandoned areas, had to change. That we couldn't do the sort of paramilitary mass incarceration suppression, mass stopping, mass frisking. Everybody you stop, you ask, are you on probation and parole? That's that oppressive policing that the Kerner Commission and the Colts Commission and the other commissions said had to stop. And you had to go to community policing. And I think what Charlie Beck and I took was, from working with you, was that you gave us the freedom to create a new mission. And we said, we're not going to provide shock and awe enforcement. We're going to flip it. And instead of numbers of arrests and so forth, we're actually going to go for, is there stuff cops can do to help these traumatized communities heal and get better and reduce the violence? So we flipped to a violence reduction model and a wraparound safety model that did what you said, which was have the community accept responsibility for changing itself at the same time the cops were changing themselves. And together they created something called partnership policing. And it's a wraparound neighborhood strategy that focuses on delivering safety. And the fewer arrests you have, the better job you've done. So I think we've come up with the answer, but people can't hear it in the war that we're in right now. Talk about the difference between safety and enforcement, and the fact that so many African Americans are in these inner cities are saying, we can't tolerate this war on gangs and drugs that has 50% of our housing project males in prison. We've got to stop this. We need something different. How do you change that mission?
In your comments, you talked about this idea of shared responsibility, and echoing a comment I had made right at the beginning of our conversation. And that's something that you and Charlie Beck always emphasized, that the burden couldn't be put on the cops alone to change, that we had a right to expect that the community could also change, so that the conditions that the police were brought in to deal with so often, there were things that could be done in terms of changing the nature of why police were there in the first place. And it's something that I saw during my time in LA, that I saw not only the ability to change the police culture, but also the community culture, in the sense of the gathering, the Mothers of Watts, and the various organizations that Sweet Alice represented, and so many of them that you dealt with, that really understood that the path forward was to not just accept what is, but to basically have dreams about what could be and then work to achieve that. And understanding that the path forward meant actually working with the police and not against them, as long as the police were willing to work with them. And we've seen so much of that in LA that which gave me great hope the 7 years I was there. I look at Captain Tingarides, who was much beloved down in that area, married to an African-American woman. So there was a sign of change, if you will. There's the captain responsible for policing that area as kind of a role model in the sense of in terms of his own personal situation. And I looked at so many of the cops that were the very essence of what you would think of as that tough LA cop, lock 'em and sock 'em, hook 'em and book 'em. And Charlie Beck basically describes himself in that way when he was a young cop. And there's the Captain Green, who was one of my favorites, that he could have been the poster model for the LAPD of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That there he was in his 50s, as handsome as could be. And the wonderful expression he used when I put him down in charge of the 7-7 division. And he told the audience that, when he was assigned down there, I'm here to create change. And the change I bring is that the future is not going to be in handcuffs. And how that resonated with the audience, because here's this white captain who worked his way up through crash in the metro. And he got it. He got that, we could not engage in senseless warfare. So there are opportunities. There are examples of how it can work. And I love my time in LA because I went there with the beliefs that if you can, we had the old story, if you make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. When it comes to the issue of race, if you can make it in LA, then you can make it anywhere. Because that city, that department had the worst racial history of just about any place in America. It was even more damaging because that department was so professional in the way they went about it. Other departments were chaotic in the sense of the enforcement of it, Chicago, Boston, even New York. But because of the precision in which LA did it, if you will, almost the indifference to the impact they were having on that community. If we could change it in LA, because LA was the role model of the professional police organization in America. If we could change that, and I think we did. We began to make that change. And I know Beck attempted to continue it after I left, and Mike Moore certainly attempted to do it against great adversity. And the adversity that we bump up against is the department is never properly funded out there. There's never enough cops. And that raises the issue you're talking about, Connie, about safety. One of the reasons the cops out there were so rigid, were so almost robot-like, was that they really did believe that if they showed any sign of weakness, compassion, that it basically was going to work against them, that the community was going to see that as a breakdown, if you will. And so the thin blue line, which was basically crafted out there, I think it was Bill Parker, the former chief. I think he created that line. And it was so true in Los Angeles. It was so true. But again, I think we showed in LA that you could make a difference. And so lessons to be learned going forward. I think one of the places to start is what worked in LA. And one of the things that worked in LA, you and I talk about this very frequently, and I'm proud to have been a part of it in the sense of supporting it, because it wasn't my idea. It was you and Charlie Beck. And that's the Gang Interventionists, the Gang Intervention Academy. Most LA cops had no use for that. As chief, I was very skeptical about it. But you and Charlie made it a reality. And talk about that for a moment, because that's one of those ways that you build trust when basically the worst of the worst, you don't give up on them. You basically find a use for them, and a use in which they can feel proud of themselves and their families can feel proud of them.
Yeah, we did. There were some officers way before you and I started working who always knew the value of former gang members. Who Bo Taylor was one of them, and he taught me the art of gang intervention. And he said, Connie, we were predators, we've changed into peacemakers. And I saw a similar arc of change for Charlie and Mike Green, Officer Bob Green, and Phil Tingarides. They were gladiators, and they became guardians. They did a similar psychological arc of change inside. And when they come together, you've got professionally trained gang interventionists. They stop the retaliation shootings. They stop the shootings up at the hospitals after there's a gang homicide and they missed their target, or they got one but didn't get the other. They go to the hospital and they shoot up the ER and the doctors. Well, the gang interventionists are trained and paid and insured to protect the ambulances, the fire trucks, the hospitals. They stop the rumors. The statistics show that they almost cut out all of the retaliation shootings. And that's what makes gang homicide so deadly, is the reverberation shootings. So we actually took a real damaging dynamic in the community and turned it into a real asset for both the men and women who do it, but also for the community. And they reduce the violence and they increase the safety for everybody. But you and Charlie and Phil and Bob Green, you were a refreshing break in the culture of LAPD. And Chief Moore has tried to continue it. But that RoboCop kind of, I can't see humanity, if stop and frisk and are you on probation, that's come back. And it just can't last because we haven't made a big enough change in the bigger picture, in the conditions in the community, and they've gotten worse since the pandemic. So I'm afraid that while we have a great story to tell about when everybody gets in the boat and rows all together, and we all have a mind to change all of our behaviors and reward different kinds of outcomes, like reducing violence, increasing safety, increasing trust, as opposed to locking up as many people as we can find, because that looks good for SWAT. Once you flip the values, we had gold. I just don't think we can hold on to it because the DNA hasn't changed. The physics.
I'm actually more optimistic about that, Connie, because I look at the experience most recently in New York. And what I tried to bring back to New York in 2014 was so much of what I learned in LA about things that were working. The senior lead officer program, the quality of the training, it's the content of the training that's important now to try and change, but the way in which they were trained and the way we investigated use of force in the LAPD with the police commission and the inspector general that went into such rigid detail. I brought that back to New York. And so New York right now has some of the lowest uses of force of any police department in America. And it's the biggest in America. And last year, I think there were 26 incidents of gunfights, if you will, which I think there were 7 deaths, but almost every one of those was instigated by the criminal element. In the 70s, there were 900 incidents a year of officers using their firearms. And I also, I try to, wherever I can, to keep my own spirits up, try to find glasses that are more than half full. And one of the things that is not looked at is that in the social media world we live in today, events are magnified dramatically. That the George Floyd incident, absent that young lady filming those continuous 9 minutes, if she had stepped away for a while and come back at it, it would have been less impactful. But those long 9 minutes that for people to watch him being murdered over that period of time, that events now are magnified over and over again. But in reality, the number of events is declining and declining dramatically than from what it was. And we have a much better ability now to actually accurately document how much there is, so we can measure, are we in fact getting better or are we slipping back? The measurement we're doing right now is the measurement of the murders and shootings. And so there is a belief that we are slipping back, but we are still, thank God, so far away from where we were in the 90s. And if we're smart about it, we can stop that slide before it does repeat the 90s. But similarly also, that we need to find areas where there have been improvements. So why is there less use of police force in documented ways in which there was a person killed or a person injured by the police? And those numbers actually have been going down dramatically from high points, that because those numbers, even with the inadequacy of the documentation systems we have, that there's enough reliability there to, take some positive notes out of this going forward. And where it's happening, going down, why is it going down? Is it leadership? Is it training? Is it oversight? Is it transparency? Is it shared responsibility? The term shared responsibility, I think one of the reasons Charlie and I got along so well, Charlie Beck and I, was that we both believed in that idea that we're going to meet that community more than halfway. And what he did in MacArthur Park in the Vampire Division, which was in New York City, Grand Central Park is the crown jewel, and there's very little bad things that happen there. MacArthur Park, which was by and large the similar park, so much bad was happening there. And during his time, he changed that to the extent that he got the community together with city agencies and others to take that park back for the community. City invested in a new soccer field. They refurbished the concert stand. I still remember one of the proudest things I did was bringing the Pasadena Symphony Orchestra over to MacArthur Park to play in that park several nights every summer. And the community went crazy when somebody basically defaced that bandstand with graffiti. They were out there the next day removing it immediately because it was their park. They had taken it back from the gangs. So there's those type of victories that we need to learn from, and how do we replicate them? How were they achieved, and how can they be replicated?
Yeah, I agree, and I documented that I called it the Rampart Renaissance.
And I talk about that in the book. That the reason I spent so much time in the book on LA was that because so many positive things happened there, and the cast of characters that I met there, yourself, Sweet Alice, Jerry Chalick, Charlie Beck, in terms of the young lieutenant who went on to be chief of police down at USC, J.T. Thomas, Fred Booker. These are people who had horrific experiences as Blacks growing up, but out of those experiences, they were able to see things differently, and they became inspirations. They became inspirations to me, certainly.
Yeah, they went into policing to change it, and I think they helped with a heavy lift.
It's a really heavy lift.
Real heavy lift, and we're still lifting. When you were talking about the George Floyd murder, it made me think back to the first entry in the log was man dies in medical incident. There was nothing. It was a lie. And I remember when you sent me to interview all those cops, and one of the questions I asked them was, why do you lie all the time? And they said, we lie to survive. We're given missions that we can't accomplish. We're not promoted unless we can accomplish them, so we lie. And it took me back to what you talked about when you said you were in New York fighting the corruption. It's a different kind of corruption. It's a moral corruption. It's not money corruption. But this kind of conclusion that we place police in a position to carry out a mission that is dehumanizing and toxic, and we leave a community in conditions that are toxic. And in a way, we set up both the community and the police to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And
we asked them to take on society's failures, homelessness,
Exactly.
the emotionally disturbed. We don't equip them to deal with it. And as a result, that's where they get jammed up so often in terms of use of physical force to deal with issues that if they were better trained, if they had, if society did a better job, basically reducing the numbers of people that they had to deal with. No, they're the safety net, but they're also PEC's bad boy, if you will. They're the ones that get jammed up that for society's failures. And maybe coming out of the chaos of the moment, maybe the George Floyd legacy, the idea of out of that horrific experience that truly there's a demand for change. And it's not just demand for change in police, but a demand and change for government to take these issues much more seriously. And to try and take that energy of BLM that's been focused on the police and broaden it to government that basically creates these issues where the police have to be the entity that comes in to deal with it because there is nobody else. And yet the police end up taking the blame, the brunt of the blame. And so that energy, if we can spread it to other parts of government and force government once and for all to own up to, it's not the police problem, it's not the community problem, it's government's problem. And that's what governments exist for, to solve problems.
Well, I wish they did. They're really there to solve to serve the symptoms of the problems, which is what I found, which is why I sue them all the time.
And successfully.
And successfully. But you formulate, it's not problem solving. Problem solving policing is what you called what we call trust policing and relationship building policing. You put the two together, you get the community safety partnership that works so well in Watts, that the housing project residents said, we want the CSP cops, but not the rest of LAPD.
Yeah, we want
that formulation came
yeah,
out.
we want police legitimacy
We
and
want
police.
we want police we can trust and who see us as human beings and aren't here to destroy us. And maybe talk a little bit about when you did the smart cars, and that was like first responder. One of the demands of the protesters is that you pull back police in areas they don't have any qualification to deal with the mentally ill, the homeless, the problems that politicians have been so derelict and not solving, and they dump it on the cops. That in failing to do that, when you did the smart cars, you had social workers and mental health people responding with an officer. But a number of the folks didn't like having to roll out at 2 o'clock in the morning to go to Skid Row. Or a number of the social workers said, I don't feel safe. And police were trying to be standing in the background so that the medical workers could actually engage with the person who's having a crisis, as opposed to having a cop who really, they often end up shooting or batoning somebody or tasing them because those are the only tools they have. But the county workers were reluctant. When you say the government has to change, that's where I find we don't have to raise taxes. I don't even think we need to increase the funding for police because the police have so much of the city budgets. But you do have to change what police do. And you've got to change the community's responsibility. Those gang intervention workers, they have salaries. The counselors that come in to do crises when the kids are in trouble, they have salaries. But they're not focused on providing safety and backing up the community and the police together. So as opposed to increasing the funding for policing, which just politically, I don't see how you do it. How about reformulating and rearranging the pieces that attack as a machine together like we do in CSP?
Well, that's going to be like trying to basically put a Rubik's Cube together with blindfold on. That's the reality of it. That's why the fallacy of the defund the police movement and why that collapsed so quickly, because so many politicians jumped on the political hashtag. They came to recognize that what they were actually signing up for, and the understanding how difficult it was going to be to take all those responsibilities away from the police and set up new bureaucracies that were still going to have to rely on the police to be there in the background, because so often that reason we had police there in the first place was the conditions were so bad, so violent. But we can't give up hope. We have to, and there are new challenges now, different than the challenges I faced 70s, 80s, 90s. I speak to that in the book. I don't have, I wish I had that completed Rubik's Cube that I could expose to everybody. I don't, but that was also one of the satisfactions of working when I was in the profession, the idea of meeting those challenges. Out of crises came opportunity and challenges, and the satisfaction of being able to meet some of them, if not all of them, unfortunately. Connie, I think we're being coached behind the scene to answer some questions.
So Chief, listen, incredible arc, your journey, as well as the arc of the profession and these communities. And we've got a lot of work to do, but congratulations on the book, and our journey will continue.
Well, God forbid, we don't want to be bored, do we?
We know what to do with ourselves.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Connie. This is a conversation that all of us should be paying attention to and is ongoing. Here are a few questions that have come in. The first question says, I feel police unions are overly protective of police and do whatever they can to stall investigations and are not necessarily pro-reform. A, would you agree with that? And B, how can that change?
Let me speak to that, if I may, that I've worked with some of the arguably toughest police unions in America. New York City, the PBA with its 25,000 members, LAPD, the Police Protective, actually the name of the union out there, the Protective League, basically says it all. Boston, which was one of the earliest aggressive police unions in the country and still is, they can be a force for good, but they can also be a force for resistance. And I've been very fortunate that I've been able to, by and large, get along with my unions. That one of the limitations as a chief is a major concern of unions is benefits, salaries, et cetera. And police chiefs, by and large, are not considered in those negotiations. That politicians tend to effectively keep police chiefs out of that. Because oftentimes what they give away, rather than money where they claim they don't have enough, is they give away exactly what I think the questioner is asking about. They give away management powers and responsibilities to unions, so that it makes it very difficult oftentimes to discipline members because of the systems, the bureaucracies that are created to protect their members. So unions, we need to understand that they exist to protect their members. That is their first obligation. The public is actually a second obligation. It should be a parallel or an equal obligation. But in America, that is not the case.
Yeah. I mean, I would add, Bill, that all you need to know is that here in Los Angeles, when Chief Charlie Beck created a Preservation of Life Award to reward cops who had the right to use lethal force but found a way not to kill someone, when he issued that Preservation of Life Award, the Protective League protested. Just regressive, completely reactionary and regressive, and they have too much power. And I would suggest, instead of attacking their power directly, anybody who has any say, that the politicians and judges and anybody who has anything to do with the judicial system, they not be allowed to take league money or union money, police union money, to run their elections, because their impact is negative.
I think some of that power has been diminished as I've watched around the country, the advancement of the progressive movement, if you will. Politicians from that fact of the progressives being elected district attorneys, governors in some few instances, but very often as mayors. And in my city of New York City, the PBA is not the political force it once was in Albany. It used to be the 800-pound gorilla because of its donation capability, its ability to turn out rank and file to help in elections. That's been significantly diminished over these last several years. I think the same thing in LA, as there's been more progressive leadership elected to various positions. I think we just saw that in the last election for district attorney. The candidate for the union, an African-American woman, was defeated by a former member of the LAPD, George Gascon. So some of their power has in fact been diminished over time as the politics of time have changed. But again, I've had good times with them. I've had bad times with them. During my time, I had actually very good times with them in LA. They went along with an awful lot of the changes I tried to bring about. Even after the MacArthur Park fiasco, they did not really challenge me around that issue, the punishments that I was meting out. So where they are is not where they were. Where we would want them to be is not where they are certainly now, but hope springs eternal. But they do, in many places, still exert a phenomenal amount of power.
Next question comes from a gentleman who says, I'm a longtime Angelino, and I feel officers in the LAPD are overly protective of their culture, their norms, and their traditions, that many in the force would prefer the elevation of an internal candidate for chief as opposed to an outsider. Now, you were an outsider. The question is, did you feel any resistance being an outsider? And how does an outsider make changes and gain acceptance?
I've always been the outsider. That even in my own department of Boston, I was the outsider because I had left for 10 years and then came back. I consciously sought to go into departments where I was the outsider because it actually gave me more strength in many respects. I didn't have any baggage, that I didn't know anybody in the department, that I didn't owe anybody any favors. Nobody had anything on me in the sense of having worked with me in the past in that department. There was a lot of resistance to my coming into the LAPD, some resistance to when I came into the NYPD, and tremendous resistance when I came back to the Boston Police. So I've got a lot of experience being the outsider, but the outsider also is needed in every organization from time to time. City of Boston right now is going through that dilemma where they have, by and large, since the 1970s, always gone with an insider. And recently it's become a bit of a fiasco for them. So I'm advocating in Boston that it's time again to go to an outsider who can come in and stir up the pot. But you need the right outsider, one who recognizes that there are traditions that you want to honor, other traditions that you don't. I was hindered during my time in the LAPD, and I think Charlie, even to some extent during his time, not so much with Michael, by the legacy of the former chiefs, going back to Bill Parker on up through Darrell Gates. Gates, during my time, half of the police in that department had been hired and worked under Chief Gates. And he was revered by them. And I certainly didn't revere him. And so it was always interesting to go to the department function. You'd be up on the stage, and at the last moment, you'd hear the room start coming to life. And sure enough, here was Chief Gates coming in the back door, always timed his arrival just before the ceremony so he could get the round of applause and stir the troops up as he walked to the front of the room. He was a master at that. And there's no denying that he and Bill Parker are still looked upon by some of the older generation, and unfortunately some of the younger generation, as the great leaders of the LAPD. It's just a fact of life that you have to deal with, but you can deal with it. I think I accomplished quite a lot despite that, having to overcome that legacy in the LAPD.
A couple more questions. One question.
Connie, you might speak to that. You knew them all. You sued them all.
I'm going to take the fifth.
Next question is, in Los Angeles recently, there's been brush-ups with the police and journalists. It seems to me that is so avoidable. Journalists, and in many of those incidences, it owned the news cycle. How would you advise, or how, if you were working with the LAPD or any major metropolitan police department, how would you sort of rework or make that relationship with journalists better?
You have to deal with it both from an education as well as from a disciplinary standpoint when things get out of line. I always attempted to, in my discussion with cops about the world of journalism, about the media, that they were a entity, if you will, a profession that were essential to us in the sense of telling our story. Particularly in the days before social media, where we have the ability now through our own social media to tell a story to effectively go around the media. But for most of my time, the story was told by them. And I try to emphasize to my cops and try to exemplify it, that you work with them, you made yourself accessible to them, that you try to be as transparent as possible. And I think during my time in LA, I proved the wisdom of that model. I think by and large, a LA Times, for example, that spent most of its history investigating and beating up, understandably, on the LAPD. I think they were very surprised when I came in and met with them and did press conferences every month where everybody was invited. I take their phone calls. They were allowed back in the building, where they were basically kept out of the building for years. That I know you hate the term use, but you could use them. They could basically be the vehicle to tell your story. And the idea of emphasizing to the cops that if you think you're going to get a cheap shot in at a demonstration or something in the melee, that you're going to be able to, throw one at them, you eventually lose, because it's going to be photographed and it's going to be basically used against you. Because the media really has, what is the old expression? You don't fight people that have barrels of ink, because they can basically outfight you. I have that circumstance certainly. Think of MacArthur Park. Those of the audience that might be familiar with that event back in 2007, when my Metro division ran 14,000 people out of MacArthur Park and shot 250 rubber bullets at them, injured many people with batons, including most of the Latino media, both international and local, that were in the park that day. And you could see where some of the cops actually took great delight in running over the media encampment, knocking over the cameras. And those are the ones I came down on the harshest, because that was what I just talked about, the idea of taking advantage of the melee to effectively get back at the media. And because you don't win in that type of situation. And
Bill,
I spent
you remember
ahead,
we
Connie.
used to talk about mindset all the time, and that thin blue line mindset of us versus them. And the versus is also the journalists. It's the community, it's anybody who isn't blue. And unfortunately, that strain of DNA is more predominant than your strain of DNA. Yours and Charlie's and Bob Green and Imada Tingarides and Sandy Jo MacArthur, all of the cops we worked with, I worked with you guys and the community. That's rare. And I wish it were more prevalent. I wish it were resurging. It could again, but the us versus them is definitely back. And the attacks on the protesters, the attacks, just, there was definitely legitimate police action. But I saw a lot of gratuitous attacks on the media, and there are a lot of lawsuits. I've looked at the evidence in the lawsuits, and they're not frivolous lawsuits. So I'm afraid that we're slipping back, like the country's slipping back, and we'll move forward again. It's always 3 steps back, 2 forward, 4 steps back, 5 forward. That's how.
Also comes down to leadership, Connie, that because if you think of the people you've referenced within the LAPD, that 25 years ago, they would not have had a voice at all. That because the leadership at that time was basically, in a sense, encouraging by their own actions, the actions of their troops in the field. And I think this is where leadership comes in. That and so one of the things I found in the LAPD when I went in was there was a real desire to change, and I was surprised at that because I thought a department that had that 50 years of rigidness, but there was a whole cadre of them that really they were educated, they were smart, they got it, and they were just looking for the chance to change. The idea for a leader, I feel the leader is to basically find them.
Yeah, you found them, and now they're gone. And I'm hoping.
No, there's still keep in touch with the department. There's still a lot of them there. That times are in many respects a lot tougher now than they were when I was there. And I thought I was there at the toughest times that you could have. And I don't envy my colleagues that are in the profession right now, because these are just about the toughest times in the 50 years that I talk about in the book.
And our final question, 2-part question. What do you feel was your greatest accomplishment in your career? And similarly, what do you feel was something you failed at?
I talk about it in the book, and we've referenced her several times, Sweet Alice. And the greatest accomplishment, excuse me, was not so much an accomplishment, but an acknowledgement of an accomplishment and an accolade that I received from her. My wife, Ricky, and I were making the rounds, saying goodbye to people, and went down to her community center down in South LA, down in Watts. And we did a lot of hugging and a few little tears shed. And she says to Ricky and I that, "Chief, you know why we like you so much?" And I said, "No, Sweet Alice, why is that?" He says, "Because you see us, you really see us." And that's the high. I've had many awards and honors in my life, but I'll tell you, that simple statement for me said it all. That because she got it, she got me, she got Ricky. That the idea that we did see them, we saw their suffering, we saw what they were trying to achieve. And so that, I think, was one of the successes that said to me that 7 years in LA had been time well spent. A failure was, there were a number of them. It was like a roller coaster ride. When you talked earlier on, Connie, about that career, it's been a lot of ups and downs. But one of them was, ironically, my time with Giuliani. That I really wished I had handled him differently so that I could have stayed longer in that position. I was only there 27 months, and the crime decline was celebrated so significantly. He certainly got a lot of credit for it and carried it forward for many years as America's mayor. And but I failed to manage my boss. And by that, I mean that the tension between his staff, my staff, tension between me and him over credit. I was incensed that he didn't want to give the Jack Maples and John Timothy's of the world, or me for that matter, credit for so many of the ideas of reducing crime in in New York. And that instead of dealing with that in a different way, so I could have stayed around longer, I ended up creating a situation where, in fact, basically he forced me out. And I think if I could have stayed longer, I could have had more significant success in the issue we've talked so much about here, and that was dealing with the issue of race. because Giuliani didn't want to deal with it. He did not like the Black leadership in that city, whether it's the Al Sharptons or the elected officials, Carl McCall, David Dinkins, who he had defeated. He really had a tremendous animosity toward Black leadership in that city. And that precluded his department heads, myself included, from being unhindered in our ability to reach out to those communities. And so the success I think I had in LA dealing with the issue of race relations, I would have loved to have had that in New York many years before, but by not managing him, I basically didn't create an opportunity to stay longer where I might have been able to deal more forcefully with the race issue. So I think most people think it's strange that what is seen as one of my more significant accomplishments, New York City, 1994, for me, there was the flip side to it, and that was the failure to manage my boss.
Well, thank you very much, Bill Bratton. Thank you, Connie Rice, for participating in this conversation. Thanks again to all of you for joining us. Again, Bill Bratton's book is The Profession, a memoir of community, race, and the arc of policing in America. The book is available wherever books are sold. Thanks, and go on gently.